All right, welcome to Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we're going to go down to our smallest bit. We're going to talk about some chemistry, and you might be saying, chemistry, but I'm in biology class. I don't want to deal with that stuff. Sorry. Unfortunately, biology is controlled by chemistry, which is ultimately controlled by physics, so you need to know a little bit about both of those things. We are going to keep the chemistry pretty basic, but it is important because a lot of the things we're going to be talking about in this course are down on the molecular level, DNA, proteins, things like that. Don't worry, chemistry can be cool, I promise. My favorite bit of chemistry involves this protein here. This is my favorite protein. You might not have a favorite protein yet. I'm sure you will one day if you're a nerd like me. This protein is called GFP, which stands for green fluorescent protein. So I bet you can guess what it does. Here is a jellyfish, which naturally makes the GFP protein. It has this little barrel-like shape, and then these atoms in the middle here, when they get hit with certain wavelengths of light, they emit this green light, so it fluoresces green. Now that's really cool because you can take the DNA sequence that codes for that protein and put it into other organisms, like this frog here, and they will glow green. And you might say, well, why do that? Well, number one, because glowing science is the coolest type of science, right? And this is like mad science stuff. But actually, number two, it's really useful to add this GFP protein onto the ends of other proteins so we can track where they are in a growing organism. We'll talk more about that in the DNA chapter. So yeah, that's why chemistry is cool, because it enables these kinds of cool things to happen. So in this chapter, we are going to focus first on real basics, atoms, isotopes, ions, molecules. That involves some bonding. In chapter 2, we'll talk a lot about water, which is very important for biology. And then we will talk about carbon in 2.3, where we are dealing with carbon, which all life is based on carbon, at least all life that we know of on Earth here. Chapter 2.1. We're going to go back to basics. Hopefully you've had some of this before. If not, hopefully you will pick it up rather quickly. I'm going to keep it pretty basic, not as detailed as a chemistry course, but we will be talking about matter, what matter is, and elements, talking about subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons, how they interact to form an atom. We will talk about the ways that electrons can be donated or shared between atoms. This is critical for this process we're going to call chemical bonding. And then we will talk about most of the naturally occurring elements that combine to make up living things. There are a few atoms that are found primarily in most living things. One of them is carbon, which is a very, very cool atom. So why talk about this? Well, we're going to see several examples where talking about different atoms and ions and things like that is really important when we talk about things like membranes and how your muscles contract and stuff like that. So we have to have an understanding of chemistry to be able to get to that level. You're out there in the world and you see stuff, right? Well, what is stuff made of has been kind of one of the biggest questions. And we have this concept of what we call matter. Matter is any substance that occupies space and has mass. Mass is related to weight, but it's different. We'll talk about that distinction in lab. But matter is any substance that occupies space and has mass. Okay, so that's all stuff is matter. An element is a type of matter that can't be broken down any further by normal chemical reactions. So you might think of something like gold. Gold is an element. You can chop it up and keep chopping it, but you can't separate it into any smaller pieces by normal means. Okay. Same thing with carbon. Now you think about something like you're made up of both carbon, you got nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, phosphorus. You can split those things apart by chemical reactions, but carbon itself is an element, and gold is an element. Matter can be in different states. In normal conditions, we find matter as a solid, which if it's water, H2O, which is a molecule, it's not an element. It might be ice, could be a gas, water vapor, and then it could be a liquid, which water is normally liquid at room temperature. Gold could be a solid, like gold here. Technically, gold could be a gas. You'd have to heat it up really, really hot to get it there. Same thing with a liquid. You would need to heat gold to a high temperature to make it become a liquid. But each element can be in these different phases. Technically, there's another one called plasma, and there are other exotic potential phases of matter that don't concern us under biological conditions here. So for life, we're looking at just a few elements that make up the majority of the molecules in life. So a large majority of you, a human being, 65%, is oxygen. Okay. In our atmosphere, oxygen's only actually about 21%. I bet you may know that, but most of our atmosphere is actually nitrogen. Nitrogen is very, very important for living organisms. You'll see it makes up about 3% of you. It's found in amino acids, which make up proteins. Now, the atmosphere has a lot of nitrogen, but you're probably aware, if you're a gardener or you have a lawn, that you need to provide your plants with nitrogen. It's because the atmospheric nitrogen is in a form that most living things can't access. It has to be converted into other forms. We'll talk a little bit about that in this course. The second most abundant thing in you is carbon. You're about 18% carbon. Not a lot of it in the atmosphere. Actually, not a lot of it in the Earth's crust. We're able to get to so much carbon because we eat things that contain carbon. We'll talk about that in the metabolism chapter. A lot of hydrogen in there. Same thing, not a lot of available hydrogen, but there is a lot in the water that we drink. So these four atoms make up the majority of our molecules. There is also phosphorus that comes in, like in this DNA molecule here. So you can see in this DNA molecule, there's lots of little hydrogens in there. There's some oxygens, some phosphorus in there, a lot of carbon atoms in there, and some nitrogens in there. And pretty much that's what DNA is made of. We're going to go into the structure of an atom. The structure of an atom is important to us because it's going to allow atoms to pair up or bond with one another. When you take chemistry, you'll learn all about this. You'll look at the periodic table, all these things. But an atom is made up of three subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. You can break these off, but you have to do very, very strange things to it that you can't do under normal conditions. So we call the atom the smallest unit of matter that you can get normally. All right, so the different pieces. Well, in the center, we have the nucleus, and we have two big types of particles there. We have the protons, which have a positive charge, and we have the neutrons, which have no charge. We call this region the nucleus. Don't think of it like a cell's nucleus. It's a little bit different, but it's the center of an atom. These two things are quite large, and they have mass to them, and we add them up to get the atomic mass of something. Now, each element has a certain number of protons. That's what makes it an element. In this case, 2 protons makes this helium. If it was just 1, it would be hydrogen. We'll talk about that in a sec. The electrons are these tinier particles that are, in this model, spinning around the nucleus. If you want to really learn chemistry, you're going to have to learn about quantum physics. Electrons do weird things, but they have a negative charge, and they're very, very small, and they essentially have no mass to them. They have some, but it's negligible. Now, you're probably aware, positive and negative, those two things attract one another. So electrons are attracted to protons. That'll be important in a moment. So the atomic number is how many protons are present. Like I said, this determines what element it is. We have 6 protons in carbon. Now there's this other number here, atomic mass, that you might see on a periodic table. That's the number of protons plus neutrons. That isn't always the same. You may have heard of isotopes. These are variations of an element that have a different number of neutrons. Some are stable, some are rare, some are unstable, like radioactive isotopes, which will decay. Here we have C12, which is 6 protons and 6 neutrons. You can also have carbon-13, which has 6 protons and 7 neutrons. Same thing with hydrogen. You can have hydrogen, which has 1 proton and no neutrons. You can have hydrogen-2, deuterium, which has 1 proton and 1 neutron. Or you can have hydrogen-3 called tritium, which is 1 proton and 2 neutrons there. These are different isotopes of the same elements. They have pretty much the same properties, although they have slightly different properties in some cases. Why does this matter? Well, there's a lot of medical reasons why. You might have heard of medical isotopes that are used for imaging and radiation therapy and things like that. Or you might have heard of something called carbon dating. Okay, carbon dating is a method of figuring out basically when something died or was buried in the ground, when it originally grew and lived. All right, so how does this carbon-14 form, and why is it so important? Well, in the atmosphere, cosmic rays come down. They have a lot of energy, and they basically bump a proton off of nitrogen, and a neutron attaches, which creates carbon-14. Okay, we don't need to worry about the chemistry, but we've created a carbon that has 6 protons and 8 neutrons there. And that carbon is what we call radioactive. That means it decays at a stable rate into something else. In this case, it takes 5,700 years for half of this carbon to decay. Okay, that's what's called a half-life. This carbon in the atmosphere gets absorbed by things that live, particularly plants, which absorb carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, and then other organisms eat the plants, and other things eat those things, right? So this carbon-14 gets absorbed. A certain amount, a generally stable proportion of an organism is carbon-14. We know how much carbon-14 should be in something while it's living, roughly. When something dies and it gets buried, it stops ingesting or absorbing that carbon-14. That carbon-14 that was in it is going to start decaying to a different element. So, at the beginning, there'll be a lot of carbon-14 in it. The longer it goes, the less carbon-14 will be in that organism. And so, we can date things by using this, by checking out that ratio. So where would you use this? Well, the La Brea tar pits, for example. We have dug things out of the tar in the tar pits, and we look at how much carbon-14 is in them relative to the other bits of carbon, and we can date things with pretty good accuracy up to about 38,000 years old. Past that, most of the carbon-14 is broken down, so we can't use this for dinosaurs. Also, dinosaurs are generally fossilized, so there's no carbon in them anyways, but we can use this radiocarbon dating on these things that are relatively young here, so like the dire wolves and the mammoths that come out of there. That's pretty cool, right? There are other isotopes that are very, very useful. You've probably heard of radioactive isotopes in medicine. They can be useful for imaging. They can be produced by nuclear weapons. So there's all kinds of different chemical uses for them. The periodic table here is grouped by into these kind of columns. The stuff in the middle doesn't really concern us for the majority of biology. There are a few things like manganese and magnesium's over here. What else? a couple of things, not too much for us in normal biology. Zinc a little bit, but most of the things we're concerned with are in here and over here in the top of the periodic table. So the groups, group 1, 2, what's 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, not really much of 18. Those are grouped by what we call valence electrons. We'll come to what that means in a moment, but you're probably aware hydrogen was a big thing in life. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, those are all in here, and they have some special properties here. Okay, so you have the atomic number in the top there. That's how many protons are there. The atomic mass, that's the average atomic mass for all the different isotopes that are there and their proportion on Earth. Carbon is 12. Let's talk about those electrons and those valence groups. You'll talk a lot more about this in chemistry, but I want to give you the primer on this because elements are not always happy with the number of electrons they normally have. So the electrons kind of orbit around the nucleus, and we call these orbital shells. We're going to concern ourselves with 3 orbital shells because that's about as deep as we go. Things get different past here, but atoms want to have a full outer orbital shell. They want to have a full shell of electrons to make them happy and stable. Okay, I say happy, they're not really happy. They want to be there for stability. We call these outer electrons valence electrons. The 3 shells are 1n, 2n, and 3n. There are the possibility to have 2 electrons in the first one, 8 in the second outer one, and 8 in the third outer one. Okay, you want to have the max number in your outer shell. So hydrogen, having only 1 electron, is actually not super stable in that form. It really would either like to gain or lose this 1 electron, because then it would have a full shell or no shell, which is still stable. Helium has 2 electrons. It is very stable. You've probably heard of helium as a noble gas or an inert gas. Helium doesn't react with many things because it has this full outer shell. Something like lithium reacts quite violently. If you add lithium to water, this is why lithium-ion batteries should not, if they catch on fire, should not be submerged in water. They will explode. Lithium has 1 outer valence electron. It would really love to get rid of that. Then it would be stable with its just 2 electrons in that first shell. Carbon is in the middle. It's got 4. That's going to make carbon really interesting. We'll come back to that. Neon, on the other hand, is another inert gas. It has 8 electrons in its second shell, making it full and stable. Fluorine here has 7. It would love to gain 1 electron, and then it would be stable, right? Carbon, though, carbon could either lose 4 or gain 4. It's right in between. But that means carbon can react with lots of things. And we will see that makes it very, very important and unique for biology. Okay, and then same thing, sodium, right? Sodium as a metal, sodium will not react well with water. Sodium metal explodes when you put it in water. Now you're saying, what about table salt? It's got sodium in it. Well, it's in a different state. But sodium would love to lose that 1 electron, which it does in table salt. Chloride, on the other hand, would love to gain 1 electron. Those 2 things, I've heard that, right? Sodium, chloride, table salt. We'll come to how that works in a moment. Again, though, argon has a full shell out there. It's happy. Okay, if you need to review this, right, it's 2 to make this full, 8 to make the second one full, 8 to make the third one full. You want your outer one, whatever that is, to be full. That could be by losing this one. Now you have just your inner, ring is now your outer ring, right? And it's full. Okay. Also, we should note that electrons can be thought of as energy in a way. The further out these electrons are, the more potential energy they have. And electrons as energy will be important to us in a little while when we talk about metabolism and how we gain energy through food. Okay, so here's your cartoon diagram if you need a nice reminder of the stability factor. All right, so why did I spend a whole lot of time on electrons? Well, electrons are key for chemical reactions. We've talked about atoms and elements. Now we're going to talk about molecules. Molecules are two or more atoms chemically bonded together, so they are attached in some chemical way. How? We're going to see there are different ways that this can happen. There's kind of four basic ways that we'll talk about. In most cases, this involves giving, taking, or sharing electrons in their valence shell. So let's look at this example right here for a common chemical that you encounter every day. You probably need some of it right now. I certainly do. My throat's a little dry. We have an oxygen. In its outer shell, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it needs 2 more electrons to be stable, right? It wants to get to 8 in its outer shell, which is the 2 ring. Hydrogen, on the other hand, has 1 in that first ring. It wants 1 more to be stable. We have 2 hydrogens here. They have two electrons between them, right? And oxygen would love those 2 electrons. So what do? They share. They pair up and they share their electrons, which forms what we call a chemical bond, forming the chemical H2O. Why do I keep saying it's a chemical? Because it is a chemical. One of the things I want you to remember is that everything in the universe is chemicals, right? We tend to use the term chemical to mean something that has been synthetically created by humans, but that's not really the definition, right? So you would say, I don't want chemicals in my water, right? But your water is a chemical, right? So it's what chemicals are they? Are they harmful chemicals? Are they necessary chemicals? You're a chemical, right? You're made up of lots of chemicals. So we form chemical bonds here in this reaction. Now, down here, you see this, what's in this diagram represented in what we call a chemical formula. On the left hand, we have what are called the reactants. 2 hydrogens plus 1 oxygen yields H2O. When it's all written together, that's all bonded together. That's what's called the product, right? And this arrow shows that this is becoming that. We generally write the reactants on the left hand and the products on the right hand. This notation will be important. Now you will notice this equation is balanced. We're not going to worry about that. You'll learn all about that in chemistry class, but I want you to have heard the terms reactants and products here. All right, so if you can make chemical bonds, you probably can break chemical bonds, right? Let's look at this. Here we have a chemical that is very close to water, but this is H2O2. Remember, water is H2O. If you add 1 more oxygen to this, you get hydrogen peroxide, which is a toxic chemical. It will kill you if you drink it, right? So adding 1 extra oxygen makes it deadly. Okay. That's okay. We have ways actually of detoxifying hydrogen peroxide. That's what you can pour it on your skin and you don't die instantly. But you have hydrogen peroxide here. If you break the bonds in it, if we take 2 of these hydrogen peroxides and break them apart, we can end up with 2 waters and an oxygen molecule, which is O2, 2 oxygens together. We've taken the reactants and we've broken them apart into the products. Note how this balances, right? You got to have 2 of these to make 2 of these, 1 of those. This reaction balances. That's called conservation of matter. Matter cannot be created. It cannot be destroyed. We're not going to worry too much about that here, but I want you to have seen it before. All right, so we can make things through chemical bond formation, and we can break things apart by breaking chemical bonds. Okay, we're going to come back to this in metabolism, but usually it takes energy to put things together, to make bonds, and when you break bonds, you're releasing energy. we might wonder, which way is a chemical reaction going to go? That depends on a lot of different factors, including how much of the input, the reactants, is there and how much of the products is there. This can be a little complicated. You'll talk more about it in chemistry class, but we're going to break it down in terms of thinking about it like a water wheel. All right, most chemical reactions, the way they are written so that they will be what we call spontaneous. That doesn't mean they happen instantly. That means they want to happen, and they will happen on their own without any added energy. All right, so here's a chemical reaction, right? Let's think of it that way. Let's look at our water wheel. Okay, we have water here that's up top at a high energy state. It's going to be pulled downwards by gravity. In the process, it will release energy and it can spin this water wheel doing work. All right, so it's going to flow downwards. The water wheel is going to spin. Energy is released, right? Okay, what happens if I pour more water in over here? Well, it's probably going to spin faster, right? Because it's pushing faster and faster down. That's how hydroelectric dams work, right? We get a lot of water there and it's pushing real hard. All right, but what happens if I block this end up? Well, it's going to flow this way, but then the output is going to start to build up and up and up until it reaches the same level as the input. What's going to happen then? The water wheel's going to stop, right? Because they're at the same level. That's kind of like a chemical reaction. If you have more product that builds up, or you add more product to it, the chemical reaction is going to start to slow down, and eventually it will stop. Okay, what happens if I pour a bunch of water in on the output side? Well, if I pour in more than is over here, our water wheel is going to start to turn backwards. Chemical reactions can do that as well. If you put in a ton of products, you can actually get them to go backwards into reactants. Now, that's a little strange to think about, right? Let's look at this example here. We have a reaction. Normally, this HCO3 plus hydrogen yields H2CO3. If you start to put a lot of this in, this reaction slows down. And it will run back until they go into equilibrium. If I poured a whole bunch of this in here, it will go backwards, right? So if we don't add anything, they will move back and forth until they reach equilibrium, until they're equal on both sides. If I pour some in, it will definitely run backwards. If I poured more in on this side, it would run forwards, right? So the concentration or the amount of reactants or products determines the rate of a chemical reaction and the direction of a chemical reaction. All right, if your mind is melting, don't worry. Go back, review that, think about water wheels, think about what happens if you stopped up one side or poured some in on one side versus the other side. Let's go back to what is actually happening in the chemical reaction, though. Okay, chemical reactions, when we are building bonds, we have four general types of chemical bonds that can form. We have two that are very strong, and we have two that are weaker. Although weak is a relative term. We'll come to that. For this course, one of the key themes is that chemical bonds are stored energy. It takes energy to form them, and when you break them, you release energy. That's really important for your body, right? You take in food, you break the chemical bonds that are in there, that releases energy. You use that energy to build new bonds, to build new things like muscles and fat cells, and to build all of the other molecules that are in your body. So chemical bonds are stored energy. Key theme here. Takes energy to make them. You release energy when you break them. All right, let's talk about the four different types. We have covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are the strongest of the four types of bonds, and this happens when atoms share electrons. Our second strongest type are ionic bonds. This happens when atoms gain or lose electrons and they become electrically charged, and then opposites attract. So I'll show you an example of that in a moment. This involves something that we call ions. Our weak bonds, we have hydrogen bonds. These are due to unequal sharing in covalent bonds. That might not make sense yet. I will show you in just a moment. It will make more sense. And then we have this one called van der Waals forces. It can also be called hydrophobic interactions. These are the weakest. They're due to electron density fluctuations. We're not really going to get into the physics of this or the chemistry of this. They don't play a big role at this level yet, but you might talk about them in like a 400 level biochemistry class. And there are some examples that I will show you, but they're not going to play a huge role right now. Okay, so let's look at examples of each of these. We have our covalent bonds. This is where atoms share electrons. And we've seen this already, right? We talked about our oxygen with the two hydrogens. The hydrogens share their electrons with the oxygen. Everybody has a full valence shell, outer orbital, and everybody's happy, right? We can have also examples where atoms might share multiple electrons. Here we have two oxygens. And if the two oxygens share their two extra electrons here, they both fill up. That's what we call a double bond there. You'll see two lines written here. One line is a single bond, two lines is a double bond. They're sharing two electrons. You can even have examples where there are triple bonds, where two atoms share three electrons. Okay, now I'm going to kind of jump ahead to one of our other forces a little bit. Not all atoms share equally. This leads to what we call polar and nonpolar covalent bonds. Okay. Oxygen is a pretty big atom, right? It's got quite a few protons and neutrons. So it's actually more massive than hydrogen. This is a property that we call electronegativity. Oxygen pulls electrons towards it stronger than hydrogen. Okay. Electronegativity is an important chemical principle. It's very important for batteries and things like that. But just think of size right now. Oxygen pulls the electrons towards it more strongly because it's big. Right? That creates a small charge. We call that polar charge. There's a little bit more electrons over here most of the time. That's the delta negative. And there's a few less electrons over here most of the time. That's a delta positive. Small charges, but, right, positive will attract negative. So when we get multiples of these molecules in proximity, we might see something happening called hydrogen bonding. We'll come back to that. Okay. Here's a nonpolar. Carbon, when we have four hydrogens around it, they all share the electrons equally. Okay. And they're not pulling further one towards the other. This is a nonpolar example. But if we have the polar ones, we have unequal sharing. We have slight charges here. We'll come back to that in just a moment with the hydrogen bonds. So don't forget that. Our next strongest bond are the ionic bonds. Ionic bonds happen when electrons are transferred from one atom to another. They're not equally shared between them. They are transferred. They're physically lost and gained. This results in what we call ions. Ions are charged particles, and when you have a positive ion, called a cation, and a negative ion, called an anion, they will attract one another and can result in an ionic bond. Cation formation happens when you have loss of an electron. So sodium loses one electron from its outer shell and becomes positively charged because it's lost that negative electron. Chloride, on the other hand, is formed when you gain an electron. It's gained a negative charge, so now it is negatively charged. Positive sodium ion, plus a negatively charged chloride ion will attract one another. And these ions will form up into these crystalline lattices, which is why we get crystals of salt. Okay, so ions are held together by the positive to negative attractions. They're not actually sharing the electrons, they've lost or gained them. This will be very important, that gain and loss, when we talk about metabolism. Also, these ions are very, very important in your body. You need these ions to regulate how your muscles function and how your nerves function. That's why when you exercise, you often need to drink salty drinks that have these ions in it, particularly if you're sweating heavily. There's a whole sports drink industry based around this, but also you don't want too many of these ions in certain places, because you've probably heard of things like gallstones or kidney stones. Those can often be crystallizations of the ions in your body. So like a kidney stone is a crystallization of ions in your kidney, and then that's got to come out, and that comes out through your urethra, and I hear that is extremely painful. All right, why do I mention these terms? So salt is NaCl. Well, knowing the chemical formulas for things is really important, because here's a great story. My wife worked as a lab tech at University of Connecticut, and she talked with the safety officer, who told her a story about how one time an undergraduate student was working in the lab alone, and they spilled a bottle of NaCl. And they called him up and they said, "I spilled a bottle of NaCl." And he's like, "What the heck is NaCl?" This student had not taken chemistry, so he suited up, because he couldn't figure out what it was, in his whole protective stuff, and came over to the lab, only to pick up the bottle and find that it was NaCl, sodium chloride, table salt. Not a dangerous chemical. The student did not know that Na was the symbol for sodium and Cl was the symbol for chlorine, and that when they're together, they make table salt, right? So, knowing these things can save you some embarrassment, but also make sure you're safe. All right, those were our two strong bond types. We're going to go to our weak bond types, which, although I say they're weak, they're only weak when we look at them individually. When they come together in millions and trillions and billions, they can be quite strong. So let's go back to the hydrogen bond, which is caused by polar covalent bonds and their interaction. So a hydrogen bond is an attraction between the positive end of one polar covalent molecule and the negative end of another one. So let's re-examine water. The oxygen, more electronegative, pulling the electrons towards it. It's got a slight negative charge, whereas the hydrogens are left with slight positive charges. Now, when you get two of these water molecules together, the negative part is attracted to the positive part of another one. And then if you added a third, that same thing would happen, and a fourth. And when you get several million or billion water molecules together, these hydrogen bonds can become quite strong. So you're probably aware of the property of water called surface tension. Surface tension is what forms the meniscus on water when you drop it. It forms a little bead, right? Or surface tension allows water strider bugs to walk on the surface of water. This is water. You can see the slight depression there, but the water is actually holding together by these hydrogen bonds. It's not strong enough to hold you. That's why when you cannonball into the pool, you sink down, right? But the water strider, it's small enough and has enough surface area to spread out the force across those hydrogen bonds. So alone, they're weak, but millions and billions, they become quite strong. Now, hydrogen bonds are going to be really important for us because we're going to talk about DNA. And DNA is a double helix. It's kind of like a ladder that's zipped together. And those bits in the middle that are held together, they're held together by hydrogen bonds. And that will be important when we come to DNA. So don't forget about the lowly hydrogen bond. It's very, very important for us and for the properties of water that we'll talk about in a moment. All right, the last one, van der Waals forces or hydrophobic interactions. This kind of has to do with how electrons are distributed, and this term hydrophobic means hydro, water, hydrophobic fear, water fearing. There are some molecules that don't like to interact with polar water, like oil or fat. Those don't like to mix with water because water is polar. They're non-polar. Anyways, this is not a great explanation of what van der Waals forces are, but I can show you an example of them at work. If you've ever seen a gecko climb a piece of glass, it does that by all these tiny little, almost hair-like projections on its feet that have huge amounts of surface area, and they create a van der Waals force. You probably have experienced these if you've ever used command strips, right? Command strips don't have any adhesive or glue on them. What they do is they utilize hydrophobic forces. So when you stick a command strip, it says wait 30 minutes before you hang the thing on it because those hydrophobic forces are building up. If those hydrophobic forces don't have enough to build up, then in the middle of the night, your picture frame falls down and it freaks you out, okay? Don't know how I know that, right? I don't have any experience with that, of course. Never had anything fall off the wall. If you want to know more about van der Waals, please go take a chemistry course. They will explain it better than me, and they'll get into the physics behind it. There are a few scenarios in our molecular biology where they come in, but we're not going to concern ourselves with those in this course. All right. So, we made it through chapter 2.1. That's our crash course in chemistry. If you need to go back and review any of those parts, please do. The textbook is a great source as well if you need to read about it. But we've talked about matter. Matter is made up of atoms, and elements are when we can't break down an atom any further by normal chemical reactions. So that's like gold or sodium or oxygen. The most common elements in living organisms are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Phosphorus is a close one there. Atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Those electrons are really key to how chemical reactions are going to occur. That's because the number of electrons in the outer orbital can influence how an element will react. So remember, they want to have full outer shells. That could involve losing electrons or gaining electrons or sharing with someone else to do that. So chemical reactions involve sharing, taking, or giving of electrons. Molecules are two or more atoms chemically bonded together. In a chemical reaction, we write it with the reactants on the left-hand side, which proceed to the right to become products. We have four types of chemical bonds in order of strength. They are strongest: the covalent, which involves sharing of electrons; the ionic, which involve giving and taking of electrons and then forming charged ions which attract each other; the hydrogen bonds, which are formed by polar covalent bonds and that weak charge between them; and then the van der Waals forces, which are difficult to explain but are hydrophobic interactions. Don't worry about the mechanism of those. All right, that is it for chapter 2.1.